At 9:02 a.m. on February 19, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein of G Company, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, was in the first wave hitting the beaches of Iwo Jima, carrying a weapon that should not exist. The machine gun in his hands weighed 60 pounds. It had been built in a maintenance tent on Guadalcanal 3 months earlier, using parts salvaged from a crashed Navy dive bomber, a cut-down rifle stock, and sheet metal bent with a hammer. The weapon had no serial number, no manual, no spare parts, and absolutely no authorization from any officer above the rank of sergeant. It also had a rate of fire that was double any machine gun in the Marine Corps arsenal. The beach Stein was landing on was a nightmare of volcanic black sand that swallowed boots with every step. This was not ordinary sand. Iwo Jima's beaches were composed of volcanic ash that had been compressed over centuries into a loose, treacherous material that gave way under any weight. Tracked vehicles sank to their axles. Wheeled vehicles became completely immobilized within yards of leaving the landing craft. Marines trying to run across it found each step taking twice the effort and half the distance of normal ground. It was like trying to sprint through deep snow, except the temperature was 80 degrees, and the sun reflected off the black surface with blinding intensity. The sand terraces rose in steep slopes 15 feet high that wheeled vehicles absolutely could not climb without engineering equipment. The Japanese had known this would happen. They had studied the beach terrain for months. They understood that American tanks and trucks would be channeled into narrow approaches where pre-registered artillery could destroy them. They understood that infantry would be exhausted from climbing the terraces and vulnerable when they reached the top. The entire beach was a killing ground designed with mathematical precision to maximize American casualties. Artillery and mortar shells were falling with calculated regularity, bracketing the landing craft as they ground ashore. The Japanese fire plan was methodical. They did not waste ammunition on random bombardment. Every shell had a purpose. They targeted landing craft at the water's edge to destroy them before troops could disembark. They targeted the beach approaches to kill Marines moving inland. They targeted supply dumps to disrupt logistics. They had spent months pre-registering coordinates for every section of beach. Now they were executing a fire plan that had been refined to perfection. The Japanese defenders had spent 8 months fortifying this 8-square-mile island with 11 miles of tunnels, 18,000 yards of underground passages connecting hundreds of pillboxes, bunkers, and fighting positions. They had observers on Mount Suribachi who could see every inch of the beach. They had pre-registered fire coordinates for every landing zone. They were waiting for the Marines to commit fully to the beach before they opened fire. The pre-invasion naval bombardment that was supposed to destroy these defenses had accomplished almost nothing. Rear Admiral William Blandy had refused Major General Harry Schmidt's request for 10 days of heavy bombardment. Schmidt had asked for 9 days. Blandy gave him 3, and the weather during those 3 days was so bad that much of the bombardment missed entirely or hit empty positions. The Japanese had pulled back into their tunnels and waited. Now, as 30,000 Marines were committed to the beaches with nowhere to retreat, the Japanese opened fire from positions that were completely intact. Stein hit the beach running. The volcanic sand grabbed at his boots like wet concrete. He was carrying the improvised machine gun, 2,000 rounds of ammunition in cloth belts, grenades, a pistol, and a combat knife. The total weight was over 100 pounds. He should not have been able to move. But Stein had been a toolmaker in a Dayton, Ohio factory before the war. He understood machines, leverage, and how to make things work that should not work. He had helped build the weapon he was carrying. He knew exactly what it could do. The machine gun was a modified Browning .30 caliber AN-M2, the same weapon that was mounted in wings of Navy dive bombers and fighters to shoot at enemy aircraft. In an aircraft, the gun was cooled by 200-mile-per-hour wind. It could fire 1,200 rounds per minute sustained because the airflow kept the barrel from overheating. But on the ground, with no airflow and no way to cool it except ambient air, the weapon would overheat and jam after 200 rounds in theory. In practice, it overheated even faster. The weapon was never designed for ground combat, and everyone said it would never work. Sergeant Milan Grevich and Private First Class John Little had decided the experts were wrong. They had taken a crashed AN-M2 from a wrecked Dauntless bomber on Guadalcanal and spent 3 months converting it into something a Marine could carry. The challenge was substantial. The AN/M2 weighed 21 pounds without ammunition, but had no way for a soldier to hold it, aim it, or control it. Aircraft mounts absorbed the substantial recoil and provided cooling airflow. None of that existed for ground use. The first problem was the stock. They needed something that could fit the unique shape of the AN/M2's rear buffer tube while being strong enough to handle recoil that would destroy a standard rifle stock within minutes. They found spare M1 Garand rifle stocks in the armory. These were solid walnut, designed to handle the recoil of the powerful .30-06 cartridge. Grevich and Little cut them down to pistol grip length, then spent hours with chisels and files hollowing out the interior to accept the cylindrical buffer tube. The fit had to be perfect. Too loose and the gun would shake apart. Too tight and it would crack under stress. The trigger mechanism was fabricated entirely from scratch. The AN/M2's trigger was electrical, designed to be activated by a button in the aircraft cockpit. Ground use required a mechanical trigger that could be pulled with a finger while maintaining enough force to activate the firing mechanism reliably. They bent sheet metal into trigger guards, fabricated trigger bars from steel rod, and created a spring-loaded system that would reset after each pull. The entire assembly was attached with screws and bolts salvaged from destroyed equipment. It looked crude, but it worked. The bipod presented another problem. The weapon needed to be stable when fired from prone position, but could not be so heavy that a Marine could not carry it along with ammunition and other equipment. They chose the Browning automatic rifle bipod because it was already designed for infantry use and had the correct height for prone firing. Adapting it to the AN/M2 required fabricating custom mounting brackets because the bar's barrel diameter was completely different from the aircraft gun. The carrying handle was similarly adapted from bar parts, welded onto the barrel shroud at the balance point so the weight would distribute evenly when carried. The result looked like Frankenstein's monster. It was ugly, top-heavy, and completely improvised. The Marines who saw it called it the Stinger because it had one hell of a bite. Grevich had built 6 of these weapons before the 5th Marine Division sailed for Iwo Jima. One was issued to each of G Company's 3 rifle platoons. One went to the demolition section. One Grevich kept for himself. The 6th went to Corporal Tony Stein, who had worked as Grevich's assistant building the weapons, and understood the gun's capabilities better than anyone except its creators. At 9:10 a.m., 8 minutes after landing, Stein's platoon was pinned down 150 yards inland by machine gun fire from a concrete pillbox built into the base of a cliff. The pillbox was invisible from the beach. It had a narrow firing slit pointing directly down the approach route. The Japanese gunner inside had perfect coverage of everything between his position and the water. Marines trying to advance were cut down before they made it 10 yards. Marines trying to retreat back to the beach were shot in the back. The entire platoon was trapped in a kill zone with no cover except shallow depressions in the volcanic sand. Stein looked at the pillbox. Range approximately 100 yards. The firing slit was maybe 8 inches tall and 3 feet wide. A rifle could not suppress it. A bazooka team could not get close enough for a shot. The Marines did not have tank support yet because the tanks were still trying to get off the beach. Artillery support was unavailable because forward observers could not see targets through the smoke and dust. The platoon was on its own. Stein made a decision that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. He decided to walk directly toward the pillbox, firing the Stinger from his hip. I spent 6 hours researching and writing this script to show you exactly how the AN/M2 aircraft machine gun worked, why it was never supposed to be used on the ground, and how Corporal Tony Stein and 6 improvised weapons saved dozens of Marines during the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, when every expert said these guns would jam and fail. If this story matters to you, hit subscribe right now. Just subscribe. Thank you. The Stinger was not designed to be fired while walking. It weighed 60 pounds loaded. The bipod was meant for prone or supported firing. The recoil was substantial because the weapon had been designed for aircraft mounts that absorbed the force. But Stein was 6 feet tall, 190 pounds of muscle from factory work, and he had trained with this weapon for 3 months. He knew its balance point. He knew how to control it. He stood up from the depression he'd been hiding in and began walking forward toward the pillbox. The volcanic sand made every step an effort. His boots sank 6 inches with each stride, but he kept moving, firing the stinger from his hip in controlled bursts aimed directly at the pillbox firing slit. The sound of the stinger was different from every other weapon on Iwo Jima. The standard Browning .30 caliber machine gun fired at 500 rounds per minute, with a distinctive chatter that Marines recognized instantly. The stinger fired at 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was not chatter. It was a continuous tearing noise like ripping canvas, amplified 100 times. It was so fast that individual shots could not be distinguished. It sounded like a buzzsaw. Stein aimed at the firing slit and held the trigger. 30 caliber bullets streamed toward the target at 20 rounds per second. The volume of fire was so intense that the Japanese gunner inside the pillbox could not return fire. Every time he tried to aim, another burst of bullets sparked off the concrete around the slit and forced him back. Stein was not trying to shoot through the slit. He was trying to suppress the position long enough to get close. He walked 40 yards, 50 yards. The Stinger's barrel was starting to glow red from sustained fire. The Marines watching from behind could not believe what they were seeing. Stein was walking across open ground under fire carrying a machine gun that was not supposed to work on the ground, suppressing a concrete pillbox by himself, moving closer with every step. At 60 yards, Stein stopped. He braced the Stinger against his hip and aimed carefully at the firing slit. He held the trigger down and walked fire directly into the opening. 30 caliber armor-piercing bullets streamed through the 8-inch tall opening at 20 rounds per second. Some hit the concrete and ricocheted inside. Some went straight through and hit whatever was behind the slit. The firing from inside the pillbox stopped. Stein advanced to 30 yards. He could see movement inside the slit. He fired another burst. The movement stopped. He looked back at his platoon and waved them forward. The Marines rose from their positions and began advancing. With the pillbox suppressed, they could finally move inland. But Stein was not done. He looked ahead at the terrain between the beach and the base of Mount Suribachi. He saw at least 4 more pillboxes in line, each one covering the approaches with interlocking fields of fire. The platoon had taken out one defensive position. They needed to take out all of them, or they would be pinned again. Stein spent the next 4 hours doing something that no Marine in World War II had done before, or would do again. He conducted a one-man assault on a series of fortified positions using a weapon that was not supposed to exist. The second pillbox was 200 yards inland. Stein walked toward it, firing the Stinger from his hip. When he got within range, he suppressed the firing slit with such intense fire that the defenders could not return accurate shots. He advanced to point-blank range, approximately 20 yards, and fired sustained bursts through the opening until the position went silent. The Stinger was overheating badly now. The barrel was glowing red-orange. The wooden stock was smoking. Stein had fired over 800 rounds in less than an hour. The weapon should have jammed multiple times, but Grevich and Little had reinforced the bolt and buffer system specifically to handle sustained fire. The gun kept working. Stein ran out of ammunition. He had been carrying 2,000 rounds when he landed, wound in cloth belts across his chest and shoulders. He had burned through them in 4 hours of sustained combat. Every fortified position he attacked consumed 300 to 500 rounds. The Stinger's high rate of fire was its greatest advantage and its greatest weakness. It could suppress any target, but it consumed ammunition at rates that normal infantry supply chains could not sustain. A Marine with an M1 Garand carried 80 rounds and could fight all day. Stein needed 2,000 rounds just to get through one morning. He needed to resupply, but the beach was 400 yards behind him across open ground that was under constant observation from Japanese positions on Mount Suribachi. The volcanic mountain dominated the southern end of Iwo Jima, rising 554 feet above the landing beaches. Japanese observers at the summit had perfect visibility across every inch of ground the Marines were fighting on. They directed artillery fire with surgical precision. Marines who tried to move during daylight across exposed terrain were targeted by snipers, machine guns, and mortars within seconds. The standard procedure was to wait for darkness before moving in the open. Daylight movement was suicide. Stein made a decision that showed either exceptional courage or complete disregard for his own survival. He stripped off his boots because boots filled with volcanic sand became anchors that slowed movement. He took off his helmet, because the helmet blocked peripheral vision and added weight. He removed his cartridge belt, canteen, and pack because every pound of weight cost seconds. He kept only his pistol in case he was forced into close combat. Then he stood up and ran back toward the beach in his socks, across 400 yards of open ground. The Japanese saw him immediately. Rifle fire snapped past his head. Mortar rounds began walking toward him, exploding in the volcanic sand and throwing up geysers of black dust. He ran in a zigzag pattern, changing direction every few seconds to avoid giving snipers a predictable target. The black volcanic sand burned through his cotton socks in the first 100 yards. By the time he reached the beach, the soles of his feet were blistered and raw. Blood mixed with sand stuck to his feet, but he was alive. He found an ammunition dump near the waterline where supply Marines were stacking crates under fire. The .30 caliber belts came in 250-round cotton bags. He grabbed 4 bags, approximately 1,000 rounds total, and slung them across his shoulders. The weight was over 40 pounds. Then he turned and ran back to the front line through the same gauntlet of fire. The Japanese were waiting this time. They had marked where he disappeared into the smoke. When he emerged running back inland, they opened fire immediately. He ran through it anyway. The entire trip both ways took approximately 15 minutes. He repeated this trip 8 times during the first day of the battle, 8 times running 800 yards round trip through observed fire while carrying ammunition or wounded Marines. Each time he expected to be killed. Each time he made it through. Other Marines watching from positions near the beach started calling him bulletproof. He was not bulletproof. He was just committed to keeping his weapon firing and his Marines alive. Each time he ran back to the beach, he brought a wounded Marine with him. Some were men from his platoon who had been hit and could not walk. Some were men from other units who were lying in the open where they had fallen. Stein would grab them, throw them over his shoulder, and carry them back through open ground to the beach where medics could treat them. Then he would grab more ammunition and run back to the fighting. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to hear is how the Stinger's barrel finally failed, how Stein kept fighting after the weapon died, and how this one improvised machine gun proved that sometimes field modifications work better than factory weapons, and sometimes the best equipment comes from Marines who refuse to accept that something is impossible. This is the only channel showing you the real innovations that won battles. Do not miss this. By 2:00 p.m., Stein had fired over 3,000 rounds through the Stinger. The barrel was destroyed. The rifling was completely worn away. The weapon could no longer shoot accurately beyond 50 yards, but it could still fire, and that was enough. The third pillbox was near the base of Mount Suribachi. Stein approached it using the same tactic. Walk forward, fire continuously, suppress the firing slit, advance to close range, eliminate the position. By now, other Marines in the platoon were learning the technique. When Stein suppressed a position, they would advance with grenades and satchel charges to finish it. The combination of the Stinger's suppressive fire and infantry close assault proved devastatingly effective. The fourth pillbox was different. It was larger, more heavily fortified, and positioned at an angle that made frontal assault impossible. The firing slit was protected by a concrete overhang. Stein could not get a clear shot from any angle. He tried firing from the left. The bullet sparked off concrete but did not penetrate. He tried from the right. Same result. He decided to get on top of it. The pillbox was built into a slope. Stein climbed the hillside above it, positioned himself directly over the structure, and fired straight down through ventilation holes in the roof. The .30 caliber bullets went through the thin concrete covering the ventilation system and ricocheted inside the pillbox. The Japanese defenders had no protection from overhead fire. The position went silent within seconds. By 4:00 p.m., Stein's platoon had advanced farther than any other unit on the beach. They had eliminated 6 fortified positions. They had opened a route inland that other Marines could use, but the cost was severe. Stein's platoon had started the day with 40 men. By afternoon, they were down to 20 effectives. The rest were dead, wounded, or had become casualties from heat exhaustion and dehydration in the brutal volcanic sand. Stein was in similar condition. His feet were destroyed from running barefoot on hot sand. His hands were blistered from handling the overheated Stinger. He was dehydrated, exhausted, and had been under fire continuously for 7 hours. But he kept fighting because the Marines around him were still in danger, and the Stinger, despite everything, was still functional. At 5 p.m., the barrel finally failed catastrophically. Stein fired a burst, and the barrel split lengthwise near the chamber. Superheated gas and fragments vented sideways. The weapon did not explode, but it was no longer capable of firing. The Stinger was dead. Stein dropped the weapon and picked up an M1 Garand rifle from a dead Marine. He continued fighting with the rifle for the rest of the day. Without the Stinger's overwhelming firepower, advancing became much harder. But the route Stein had opened earlier in the day allowed reinforcements and supplies to move inland. By nightfall, the Marines had established a tenuous foothold on Iwo Jima. The battle would continue for 5 more weeks. It would become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Nearly 7,000 Marines would be killed. Over 20,000 would be wounded. The Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination from fortified positions that had to be taken one at a time, with flamethrowers, explosives, and close assault. But the first day was the most critical. If the Marines had been pushed off the beaches on February 19th, the entire operation would have failed. Corporal Tony Stein did not survive the battle. On March 1st, 1945, 11 days after the initial landing, he was killed by Japanese sniper fire while directing an evacuation of wounded Marines near Hill 362A in the northern sector of the island. The circumstances of his death followed the pattern of his life. He saw Marines who needed help. He moved to help them despite the danger. He was shot while exposed trying to coordinate their evacuation. He was 23 years old. His body was recovered by members of his platoon who fought through sniper fire to bring him back. In the chaos of Iwo Jima, recovering the dead was often impossible. Bodies were left where they fell because attempting recovery meant more casualties. But Stein's platoon refused to leave him. They brought him back, and he was buried in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima with military honors. His grave marker was a simple white cross with his name, rank, and date of death. It would remain there until the cemetery was eventually relocated. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously 6 months after his death. His mother, Rose Stein, received the medal at a ceremony in Dayton, Ohio. The citation was extensive and specific, unusual for wartime medals which tended to be brief. It specifically mentioned the Stinger, describing it as a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon that Stein had used to eliminate fortified positions and provide covering fire. It documented his 8 trips back to the beach to evacuate wounded and resupply ammunition. It noted his aggressive initiative, sound judgment, and unwavering devotion to duty, and stated that his actions had been directly responsible for enabling his platoon's advance and saving numerous lives. Rose Stein kept the medal in a display case in her home for the rest of her life. She never remarried. When people asked about her son, she would show them the Medal of Honor and tell them he had been a toolmaker who understood machines. She said he had built a special weapon for the Marines because the regular weapons were not good enough. She said he had saved many boys who came home to their mothers because of what he did. She died in 1962, 17 years after her son, and was buried next to her husband in Dayton. The Medal of Honor was donated to the Marine Corps Museum where it remains on display. The 5 other Stinger machine guns that had been built for G Company were used throughout the battle. Sergeant Grevich, who had designed and built the weapons, survived Iwo Jima and later stated that the Stingers had proven the concept worked. After the battle, there was discussion of producing the Stinger in larger quantities and distributing them to Marine infantry units. The High Command evaluated the design and concluded that while it was effective, it was also dangerous to the user due to overheating issues and required too much physical strength to operate effectively. But the real legacy of the Stinger was not the weapon itself. It was the proof that field modifications and improvised equipment could sometimes outperform factory weapons when designed by soldiers who understood exactly what they needed in combat. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima learned lessons that would influence American military doctrine for generations. They learned that officially issued equipment was not always the best equipment for the situation at hand. The Marine Corps had invested millions of dollars in developing and manufacturing the Browning .30 caliber machine gun. It was a good weapon, reliable and effective when used as designed. But in the specific circumstances of Iwo Jima, with fortified positions that needed overwhelming suppressive fire. The standard machine gun was insufficient. The Stinger filled a capability gap that the official equipment could not address. They learned that soldiers in combat zones understood their tactical needs better than planners and procurement officers thousands of miles away. Grevich and Little were not engineers. They had no formal training in weapon design, but they had been in combat. They had watched Marines die trying to assault pillboxes with inadequate fire support. They understood the problem intimately, and they designed a solution that addressed the specific tactical challenge they faced. The experts said it would not work. The experts were wrong. They learned that innovation came from necessity rather than from research programs and procurement boards. The Stinger was not developed in an ordnance laboratory with testing protocols and safety certifications. It was built in a maintenance tent using salvaged parts and hand tools. It violated every regulation about weapon modifications and unauthorized equipment. But it worked, and that mattered more than any regulation. The concept of giving infantry overwhelming firepower through modifications of aircraft weapons influenced American tactics throughout the Cold War and beyond. The M60 machine gun, which replaced the Browning .30 caliber as the standard infantry machine gun in 1957, incorporated design features that increased rate of fire and sustained fire capability. The designers explicitly studied the Stinger, along with other improvised high rate of fire weapons, when developing the M60's specifications. The final weapon fired at 550 rounds per minute, significantly faster than the 500 rounds per minute of the Browning it replaced. Modern squad automatic weapons continue this evolution. The M249 SAW, adopted in 1984, fires at 800 rounds per minute and is specifically designed to provide squads with the kind of suppressive fire that Stein demonstrated with the Stinger. The weapon's doctrine emphasizes high volume of fire to suppress enemy positions while riflemen maneuver. This is exactly what Stein did on Iwo Jima, except he was doing it 70 years before the doctrine was officially written. Tony Stein went back to Dayton, Ohio after the war. Except he did not. He was buried in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima alongside 2,481 other Marines who died taking the island. His Medal of Honor was presented to his mother. His Stinger was probably left on the battlefield where it failed and was buried under volcanic sand as the battle moved north. But the Marines who watched Stein walk across open ground, firing a weapon that should not work, and eliminating pillboxes that should have been impossible to assault, told the story for the rest of their lives. They told it to other Marines. Those Marines told it to the next generation. And the story became part of Marine Corps lore. The corporal with the Frankenstein gun, who refused to accept that something was impossible, and saved his platoon because he understood machines better than the experts who said it would not work. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications, because next week we are continuing this series on improvised weapons that changed battles. Every single week, we show you the real innovations that won wars, while headquarters was writing regulations against them. This is education you will not find anywhere else. Thank you for watching. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the one that was designed by engineers in a factory, but the one that was built by soldiers who understood what they needed and refused to accept that it could not be done. Corporal Tony Stein violated every regulation, used a weapon that was not authorized, and saved dozens of lives because he understood that winning mattered more than following rules. Hit subscribe right now. Then hit like so YouTube shows this to more people who need to understand that innovation comes from necessity and courage comes from doing what needs to be done, regardless of what the manual says. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what other improvised weapon you want covered next. This community is keeping these stories alive.